Thank you very much, Torleif. Thanks everyone for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. And actually, I would like to start by thanking a few other people, well, all those people who've helped me to get here. Especially my family, a few of whom are here today. Thanks for coming. All my colleagues through the years. Great to see a few of old colleagues here too. And especially two people who actually gave me the chance to kind of kick off my career. The first one of those, somewhat notorious, Andrew Dragan. And the second one was my predecessor in the post I now have, Professor Emeritus Ingmarie Gren. I'm not sure if she's here. No. Okay. So I'm going to talk about technological progress and the human takeover of Spaceship Earth. And first of all then, what do I mean by Spaceship Earth? So, Spaceship Earth basically is a metaphor for the planet we're living on, that we're totally dependent on, but that we also, to some extent, have taken control of over roughly the last 70,000 years. And the key to that takeover is technological progress. 70,000 years ago, we were one among millions of species on Spaceship Earth. There was nothing that special about us, certainly not in relation to our effects on the planet. But that all started to change round about then. And that technological progress, for instance, not least in food production, has allowed us to expand our choice set massively. Here we are, hunters and gatherers, maybe 10, 20,000 years ago, and here we are today. A lot has happened. And as I said, that technological progress expands our choice set. It gives us more choices. If we go 70,000 years ago, it's giving us choices about where to live. We can move out of our original range and move into new areas thanks to being able to make clothing and so on, make boats. And we can also support more people on the same area of land through increasing productivity. So, what choices have we made and why? Well, I'm going to start in the pre-industrial era, which is not my area of research, but I'm just going to say briefly a couple of things. In the pre-industrial era, it's pretty straightforward. We basically chose to increase population. And you could link this to the ideas of Thomas Malthus, came up with this a couple of hundred years ago. And essentially, Malthus said, look, humans are like other species. Of course, Darwin, he hadn't had Darwin at that time, but if our fitness increases, our population increases, but not our welfare. And of course, our fitness increases if we learn better technologies. And we can see this pretty clearly in the data. If you just think about a typical household at any time in this period, they're pretty much on the breadline, at any point. Essentially, the welfare of the household is more or less the same, but what's happening over time is that as we develop our technologies, we get more people. What were the consequences of this, as a little aside, for the other species on the spaceship? Some of you might have an idea of a sort of idyllic, pre-industrial world where humans and nature lived in harmony. So here we see the moa on New Zealand. We wiped them out about 100, 200 years within the time of arriving on New Zealand. And the same story can be said for a lot of different species, including, of course, other human species, who we basically wiped out as we got to the different places where they lived. Here we've got Neanderthals. A few other species which were kind of useful to us, we've boosted massively over this period. So first take-home message, pre-industrial life was no picnic, not for the sapiens, who were more or less on the breadline, and plenty of other species as well were having a tough time. But now to the post-Malthusian economies, where we've broken the link between technological change and population. And this is my focus. And this is one part of my research over the last 5 or 10 years, which I'm trying to give you an insight into through this talk, basically. And what I'm trying to do in this research is to build models which, oops, got the wrong button, sorry. Build models which account for aggregate data and are consistent with key physical traits. That might not sound like rocket science, and it isn't in a way, but economists have had a remarkable degree of difficulty in achieving this. They tend to achieve number 1, but kind of not bother too much about number 2, and then you end up with some very strange conclusions. And that's what we're going to look at. So what are the central questions for the post-Malthusian industrial economies? Well, over time, we know that we need less and less labor to produce the basic needs, like food. So we have fewer and fewer people working in agriculture because we get more and more, each person gets more and more productive, the land area is fixed. It's not rocket science. So what do we do with the surplus labor, which we don't need in agriculture anymore over time? You could say there's 2 choices. We could just chill out, or we could produce other stuff that isn't basic needs. And to a very large extent, we've chosen not to chill out. We've chosen to produce more and more other stuff. To a certain extent, we chill out more these days than we did 200 years ago, but it's not such a big difference compared to the GDP difference. We're going to sort of park that. It's kind of interesting why that is. We're going to look at the other follow-up questions. Given that we choose to keep working, what should we produce and consume, and with what inputs and technology? And the patterns of production are strongly linked to primary resource use, and the choice of technology is strongly linked to pollution. And this is what I show in my research, what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. So let's have a look at primary resource use. Here's some global aggregate data. For those of you who aren't mathematicians, these lines, the slopes basically show growth rates, okay? So we've got the dashed lines showing growth rates of GDP globally, and the continuous lines showing the growth rates of use of natural resources globally. Metals on the left, primary energy on the right. So what we see is that the very long aggregate trends are that the primary resource use tracks the growth in GDP, which is kind of odd, because it means there's no increase in resource efficiency at the aggregate level. We're not getting more value out of each barrel of oil over time, for instance. That's kind of odd, isn't it? Why not? Most of the existing literature says it must be because we just didn't develop resource-efficient technology. But my recently published work shows it's actually due to shifting consumption patterns. It's not the firm's fault. And I'm just going to take you through a very simple macroeconomic model to show you, demonstrate this. So what have we got in this model? We've got households, we've got we've got final good producers, and we've got an energy sector. And as you can see, 90% of the labor force is in the final goods sector, 10% is in the energy sector, and we're making cars. And then there's a few people doing research as well. And then maybe 20, 30 years pass, and the researchers come up with more efficient technologies. So we can get more out of our labor force. So the same labor force can get up twice as much oil per year. The same labor force can make twice as many cars, everything's still nice and balanced, and it fits the aggregate data. But there's a big problem. It doesn't fit the product level observations, which show that we have made internal combustion engines far more efficient over time. So it should look like this. Okay, the motors have got more efficient. We shouldn't need double the amount of oil. So now we're fitting product level observations, but not the aggregate data. So what's the solution? We need shifts in patterns of consumption across products. We need a model with multiple goods. So here we are in 1850. I don't know if there's any historians here, if they can correct me, but here we are, and the only thing we're consuming is porridge. Okay. Yes, we can talk about it later. Then 50 years later, we've had some technological progress, and we're consuming porridge and train rides. And the train rides are intrinsically more energy intensive than porridge. We're getting more energy efficient at making both porridge and train rides, but at the same time, we're switching the balance of our consumption towards train rides. Another 50 years passed, and we started driving around, which is even more energy intensive. And then we're flying by the year 2000, and in 2050, we may be popping off to the moon for a look back down at the planet for a summer trip. So, second take-home message. As the economy grows, consumers choose more energy-intensive goods. Hence, the effect of increasing efficiency of given products is cancelled out by shifts between products. Less porridge, more flights. Okay, how am I doing? Not too bad. There's still a lot to go. Okay, second area, pollution. So here, in theory, I'll sort of cover this now with my hand. If we look at the left-hand side of these two figures, we see a similar pattern. Pollution is tracking natural resource, tracking GDP. But on the right, it nosedives. I've just taken two examples, sulfur dioxide in the UK and CFCs, freoner, globally. I could have taken any number of examples. Okay. So why is this? In the literature, we see myriad explanations, mainly based on assumptions about changing abatement costs. Basically, there's ideas that, it gets cheaper to get rid of the pollution over time or with economic growth, so therefore we start doing it more and more. But my research shows that's not correct. It's basically all about the choice of technology. When we're poor, we choose cheap and dirty technologies. When we're rich, we choose expensive and clean. And here we've got a little model to get our heads around this. So here we are. Maybe we're back in 1850 or 1900, using coal as an input to the final goods sector, making this stuff, bags of wheat or oats perhaps, and we've got emissions. And we could use solar or some other clean alternative in this model, and we'd get rid of the coal and we'd get rid of the emissions. But let's assume that the solar alternative, the clean alternative, is trickier. We need to shift labor out of the final goods sector into the energy sector, and we're going to lose 10% of our production. Let's assume this economy, we're in 1850 or 1900, households are more or less on the breadline. Which is our social planner? We can call him Stefan. Which is he going to choose? I think he's going to choose the left-hand option, right? But if we fast forward 50 years, now Stefan is starting to think seriously about losing 10% of this massive consumption to get rid of this now very bothersome pollution. And if we fast forward another 50 years, it's a no-brainer, right? So what's going on here? There are predictable changes in relative valuations over time. the relative private costs of alternative technologies don't change systematically. The cost of switching from coal to solar. There may be changes, but it's more random. But the social costs, our valuation of damages, rise systematically over time as we get richer. So therefore, we switch from cheap, dirty, to clean, expensive over time as we grow richer. So the take-home message 3, as growth continues, environmental concerns are going to become ever more crucial in determining the choice of technology. More and more technologies previously considered benign or too expensive to replace will be replaced by cleaner alternatives. So the change to low carbon, if we link to climate, is only a question of time, for instance. With scare quotes around only, because we might still do it too late. This has major implications for agriculture. So according to the above, relative private costs of alternative technologies in agriculture should stay more or less the same. How much profit are you going to lose by switching to organic or by doing without neonicotinoids, glyphosates, etc.? Should stay more or less the same over time. But what about the social costs? That will change systematically. The valuation of negative effects like nutrient leaching increases. The valuation of public goods produced by agriculture also increases. And I was going to show you some evidence on the private costs, which is linked to the gradual decline in food prices. But I think I'm going to pass on that because I'm running out of time. Okay. If Tor lives says I have time, then. So basically what we see here is prices over a pretty long run for some 3 key Swedish food products. And we see a gradual decline. I could have shown you even more long-run data for the US with an even bigger decline, or for global wheat prices, for instance. Why is this? It's because, effectively, the enormous increase in the efficiency of agriculture, labor efficiency. So what this means is that the value of what we can produce per hectare stays more or less the same. So if you're going to sacrifice 10% of your production or 30% by switching to organic, the cost of that is also going to stay more or less the same. So the take-home, current trends are going to continue in agriculture. Don't think this is a passing fad. Stricter regulation, pesticides, animal welfare, etc. It's only going to get tougher. More emphasis on public goods, biodiversity, organic farming, etc. But that raises the question, where's the food going to come from? Because all these things are probably going to cut production of food from the fixed area of Swedish agricultural land, or more or less fixed. We could boost it somewhat, of course. We've been cutting it over time, but there's clear limits to that. So if we produce less, we're not going to eat less, are we? We might do if we cut down on meat, of course. That's one aspect. But let's assume this is going to lead to bigger imports. But what if we value nature and biodiversity abroad as well? Then we've got tricky dilemmas, which some people in SLU have been doing research on outside the Department of Economics, but this is a really big and interesting economic issue. So the global effects of national agricultural policies are going to attract increasing attention. That's my 5th and final, I think, take-home message. Finally, a few brief words on a couple of future research ideas. The first one. So we know that households tend to choose work over play and choose to shift consumption towards resource and energy-intensive goods. And we had that parked question, why was that? Well, could both of these be driven by a desire for conspicuous consumption, to show off? Are we showing off to each other through earning a lot of income and spending it on fancy stuff. To the extent that this is true, then policies dampening labor supply, as in Sweden, should be actually favored rather than frowned on. They're typically frowned on by economists. We don't want to dampen labor supply. But to the extent that this is true, we actually have a negative external effect purely by not supplying too much labor and not chilling out enough. So that's one area I'm planning to look at in the future. Is this conspicuous consumption idea true, or how true is it? And what are the implications? The other one is about how we use the fixed area of the spaceship. We want it for lots of different things: food production, energy production, recreation. But we also want other species to thrive. How is that going to play out in the future? Well, we're going to have, assuming we have, continued increases in productivity with higher incomes, that is going to drive two things. One, more consumption, and two, switches to clean technology. The trouble with clean technology is it tends to require more land. So it's a double whammy for other species. We might be getting rid of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, but we're taking more and more land i anspråk, whatever you say in English. So what hope is there for the other species? There's sort of two straws for them to cling to. One is we might realize that we need them for the ecosystem services they provide. And this is a sort of Rockström story. Yeah. But the other one is perhaps we just decide that we really care about them more than our consumption goods and that we want to cut them some slack. The trouble with the Rockström idea is if we pin our colors to that, and then we find actually we don't need them. So which, if either, is most likely to happen, that's a sort of long-run research goal for me to look into. Thank you very much.